Welcome to our first look at our review slides for The Triumph of Nationalism. So the Triumph of Nationalism is a unit that takes place about 1815, as we'll see with the Congress of Vienna. And we could go as far as about 1900 as we see events in largely Europe unfolding that are affected by this growing sense of nationalism. So we're going to look at nationalism through the 1800s. We will emphasize Germany and Italy and also take a look at Austria-Hungary. So it's great to start with this idea of looking at how the map of Europe was restructured through 1700, 1800, up to 1900. And so here's a series of graphics that shows you 1700, as you can see up here, okay, through 1800. So watch 1800, and then 1900. Okay, and let's go back and again go through. Okay, so one of the things that we look at is largely a Europe that's like this. We've got some dominating countries, certainly France, but Poland also exists at this time. Of course, there's Spain down there and Russia and whatnot. But look in here, this dirty, messy mumble jumble of things. Okay, and we go into 1800. This is the time of Napoleon's rise. We see France getting bigger and Austria being a powerhouse here, and this country Prussia, see, which if we go back to 1700, was, I presume, this piece here. Okay, and then finally to what we're a little bit more used to, should be at the turn of the 1900s, something like this, where you have, again, France, Great Britain, you have this Germany, and you have this Italy, and they were not there 100 years ago. And you'll see that there's missing this idea of Poland, and even Austria-Hungary is now this big, massive territory. So there's a definite shift in borders, a cleaning up of Europe, so to speak, through the 1800s, as countries will unite based on nationalist sentiments. So that's really a good starting place, is to look and see that the map of Europe is going to change, and it is highly affected by Napoleon, the French Revolution, and the Congress of Vienna, which is what we just looked at. So you guys just read European Leaders Sought Stability. If you haven't read that yet, go ahead and give that a quick read and come back for our review. Okay, so welcome back. Let's go through some of the points we want to emphasize with this chapter. The first is this Congress of Vienna, which takes place in 1814 and 1815 through that winter. After the, first defeat of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna was a meeting in Austria, in Vienna, Austria. It was a meeting of European rulers and diplomats throughout Europe. It was a celebration, in many ways, of the defeat of Napoleon, but it also had the purpose of undoing the changes caused by the French Revolution and Napoleon. The main goal of the diplomats who were meeting there was to redraw the map of Europe and to stabilize the continent to create peace. And doing so through diplomacy versus war and military. As you could imagine from the people of the time, seeing the torment and the terror wrought through France and all the deaths and casualties through the Reign of Terror, etc. And also the idea of Napoleon and his military campaigns wreaking havoc upon Europe. The last thing Europeans would want at this time is more war. And so they're very motivated by the sense of achieving peace. So a little bit more on this. It was a congress or a convening of diplomats and other aristocracy and whatnot throughout Europe. And they joined together in celebration, of course, but they had high hopes of restoring Europe to the old order. And it put themselves in the benefiting position as aristocracy and as nobility through Europe. The old order preferred or showed benefit to the aristocracy. And it put the lower classes, in a sense, back in their place. And you know that one of the factors that led to the French Revolution was the rise of the voice and power and anger of the lower classes of the third estate. So through diplomacy and people acting on behalf or representatives of their countries and kingdoms, etc., they agreed to the Vienna settlement in 1815. What this did is it redrew the map of Europe to ensure this idea or vision of peace in Europe by creating a balance of power, which we will talk about in a minute. And it is something that accomplished peace in Europe for about 40 years till about 1853, when the first war or military conflict began to arise in Europe. So that's quite an accomplishment. In World War I, for instance, the League of Nations met to achieve much the same thing, to redraw the map of Europe and to establish peace. And even the League of Nations attempt to never have a war to end all wars ended in ultimately creating the conditions that led to World War II. So, as diplomats get together with the intent of creating peace, it very rarely works out. In the case of the Vienna settlement, it actually kind of does. The Vienna settlement, unlike the post-World War I, was not a direct cause of stirring up future war. In fact, the next major war to occur across Europe would be, in fact, World War I. So we'll probably mention a few more times. So it's about 100 years of universal peace, or 100 years until there's a major military conflict in Europe. And World War I would be a war that had never been seen at that scale up to that point, even with Napoleon's campaigns. Okay, the idea was that it would last a couple weeks, but it goes on for 9 months, and part of that was because Napoleon had returned from the island of Elba and relaunched his campaign to hold power. They had to defeat him again, of course, and then exile him the second time, but that was a couple of units ago. So one thing that's going on in Europe right now is the clashing of the great powers. Remember those coalitions that formed against the French and Napoleon during the time of the French Revolution? Those powers are still in effect, and France was the greatest of all of those powers, at least in mainland Europe, and Napoleon was able to use that power and create his empire. But there were 5 here. They were powerful enough to shape international events. And unfortunately, we tend to be like, okay, these are the important players. Not any other country that may have been minimally involved that just wasn't as powerful. But, the powerful countries in the world tend to shape history more so. And we know who they are today. And back at this time, they were Russia, Austria-Hungary, or Austria, Great Britain, of course, or Prussia, which doesn't exist anymore. It was a German country, the most powerful German state. And then, sorry, did I say Russia? France, and then Russia, okay, down here. So we have these 5 powers. Now, the leaders there were present, but their diplomats and representatives and whatnot were also in the talks and discussions and whatnot. But they would have been King Frederick William III of Prussia, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, Emperor Francis I of Austria, and it was also here in Vienna during the time of the Congress of Vienna that Beethoven was composing and performing symphonies. It was kind of a classy thing to attend a composer. They were very famous people at that point in time. So another thing that arises during this century is political philosophies as motivated by reaction to the French Revolution, largely. We already know that in the French governments through the French Revolution, there kind of sat this kind of conservative part, this more liberal or extreme part, and then this neutral middle part. And we got this left-wing, right-wing ideologies forming in the realm of politics, which we see to this day. Conservatism at this point in time was defined as people who saw the French Revolution as harmful, that it shouldn't have happened, that nothing good came of it, that the traditional government or the old order was the preferred way. That would have been constitutional or absolute monarchies. So kind of a variance between essentially a king on the throne, to what extent, constitutional or an absolute monarch, would have different preferences there. But conservatism really looked to restore the old order. The old order preferred the nobility. It gave privilege to the nobility, and it was tied up in a government run by a king or a queen. Okay, now a liberal ideal at the time was that they saw some of the reforms of the revolution, they were actually good. So this idea of democracy, this idea of more power to an elected government, so an elected government by the people, they disapproved of the violence and the revolutionary part of the French Revolution, but the ideas they promoted. Now they did fear the electorate mob, so it wouldn't be like everybody gets the right to vote. That could be mobbish or dangerous or get out of hand, but that the idea of appointments or elections should be kind of broadened somewhat, and that the people, to some extent, so the higher, more educated, whatever classes of people should have input in the government. So it shouldn't just be an absolute monarch then. Now, this is obviously not giving the ideas of democracy a universal experience. So there's going to be people who are going to be more radical here, because the liberals of this time would not really extend those same rights to everybody. So then you have radicalism. Radicalism would have said that all of the changes brought about by the French Revolution were necessary. The revolution was necessary. They had to create drastic change in order to create justice and recognize the natural rights of the human beings present there. They would have justified violence and rebellion at the time. So they would have seen that as justifiable. And primarily lower or working class people who didn't have the benefits of political power or influence would have promoted radical ideas potentially at the time, because they're kind of voicing their rights and what have you. So these are kind of the three factions that begin to arise in politics, even more so at the time. And we know that we use a lot of these labels to this day: conservatism clashing with liberalism. It seems, though, that the criteria keeps consistently shifting a little further left. So in the case of modern conservatism, okay, they're going to definitely support ideas of an electorate or democracy, or definitely oppose the ideas of absolute monarchy and stuff like that. Whereas liberalism has continually shifted, pushing the boundaries of what we're liberal about, or dare we say, what we're more and more radical about. So as these achievements tend to kind of sway towards the side of liberalism and radicalism over the next few centuries, the question I have is, how much, is this shift going to just keep happening? Is it just going to keep shifting left, so that these ideals will always be kind of, shifting a little bit left, so that, at some point, when does that end? When does it end? When does radicalism become even too radical for the radicals? Interesting question. Are we at a perfect society yet? And has our shift to the left been a benefit to the world? Okay. Now, I like the ideas of these. This is good. I think diversity of opinion, even in political thinking, is good. These all need to be challenging one another, even in our present day politics, because you can be blinded by your philosophy unless you are challenged by it. So it's all good. I think that we need people of all sorts to provide input and govern our country. It is interesting that we have, throughout Canadian history, a constant shift between governments that are conservative and governments that are liberal. That's the fact of the matter. So even to this day. Okay, so we move on to Metternich, and he was the European aristocrat who was an extremely influential diplomat at the Congress of Vienna. He could be said to have had the single most influence there. And he had three goals that ended up ultimately coming to pass. One was to strengthen the countries surrounding France so as to keep France in check, to restore a balance of power in Europe overall, to avoid conflict, as we'll talk about in a second, and even to restore these royal families to their thrones. Remember, they had been displaced by Napoleon, his campaigns, as he set up different governments in his puppet states and whatever, and overthrew the reigning monarchs in those places. So Metternich, now he was a prince of a German noble family, the House of Metternich, who arose through the ranks of Austrian politics to become influential through the 1800s. Probably the leading influential person of the 1800s in European politics. He and many others were highly conservative in the thinking that Napoleon's campaigns and the French Revolution were result of the experimentation that comes about with experimenting with democracies and giving people a say. In other words, if you give the people a say, what happens? Well, the French Revolution is a great example of what happens. There's utter chaos and destruction and instability. So therefore, the solution, since the French Revolution failed, is to keep things the way they were. And that would be to essentially keep the old order and keep your monarchs in power, even to increase your level of absolute monarchy control in some of these countries. So that's Metternich, and these were his three things again: to strengthen the countries surrounding France, to establish a balance of power, and to restore the monarchies. So then we talk a little bit about what balance of power means. The attempt in the Congress of Vienna was to curb war, to curb military conflict between countries in Europe. They were sick of war. So how to do that? Well, you restore a balance of power so that no country is willing to go to war with another, because they kind of offset a chain reaction of having a global or a continental war or whatever. You wanted to keep a balance of power. Everybody was kind of happy and not really likely to instigate conflict because of pressures of other countries around you or whatever. So how did they do this? Well, ultimately, they redrew the map of Europe to do this. Now how did they do this? Through diplomacy, through negotiation, through who they put in power in these areas, and also through recreating or redrawing borders, territories, by assigning territories to countries or whatever. So first thing is that they did this by making the countries surrounding France stronger. This would offset France's power, be less likely for France to start a continental invasion again if you set up the borders stronger. Now, the next is they didn't weaken France too much. They needed France's power to keep the balance of power, to keep other countries in check. So you couldn't just wipe France off the map and distribute France's territories to everybody else. Okay? They kept France, which was kind of a compassionate move, but it also is important because France was a global superpower or a global power at the time, and to get rid of it would have just caused a lot of anger in the people, and who knows what would come about from that. So it was kind of a wise move not to eliminate France. You just weaken it. It actually restores France's borders to pre-1790, so before the French Revolution, which is kind of interesting. What they also do is they reinstate the Bourbon dynasty or the Bourbon kings into French royalty. This is crazy. You got 25 years later, and France is right back to where they started, because 1789 was when the French Revolution began. Through that time, they changed their borders, expanded their borders, executed their king. Okay, only to return to the same borders and same line of kings. So what was the French Revolution for ultimately? And when you end up back where you started. Now, failure doesn't necessarily mean failure. There's a lot we learned through that historical experience. but it is kind of interesting. They end up right back where they started. Okay, the great powers do take more territories for themselves. So Austria goes and takes some of northern Italy. Russia takes some Poland or territory of Poland. Poland's eliminated altogether. Prussia, some of Germany, and Britain get some overseas colonies to broaden its global empire. So they kind of all chunk up the world a little bit and redraw and benefit for themselves, but all in a way that makes them all happy. Um, I don't know if it makes the people that kind of got that territory chopped up happy, but there you are. What they did is they tried to restore overthrown monarchs where possible, and it does bring about a balance of power for peace and economic security in the continent. Okay, through diplomacy, no country left the Congress feeling shafted or unfair. Though conflict would occur in the middle of the 1800s, as we will see, no major war would happen until World War I, as we have mentioned. So it does achieve what it set out to do, create a balance of power. The problem is it reverts to conservatism to do this at a time where human philosophy and sentiment and ideologies are changing. And one of the factors they didn't take into consideration here was the power of nationalism and the ideology of nationalism kind of undermining what they had set out to do here, as we will talk about in future chapters. So ultimately what we end up with is in 1815 is a Europe that looks like this. And the Europe here, you can see France restored to its former borders with Corsica here. You have Great Britain, or the Kingdom of the United Kingdom. Okay, and they get some overseas colonies, as we had mentioned. You have the Austrian Empire, and this just kind of goes to show the German part of the Austrian Empire, part of Germany, modern day Germany, but also kind of the territories that are not of German origin. Okay, Prussia becoming a global power here. They've got two kingdoms, not even connected. So, and you can see a lot of countries have that. The Netherlands is kind of unified into a little bit of a bigger power. Prussia set up here right along the border of France, as we saw, to offset the power of France. And even Kingdom of Sardinia. Sardinia is this island down here, and yet they're given this nice big chunk of northern Italy as well. So, and that, again, this is a powerful European upcoming kingdom, and they can now off pressure France's, military plans potentially. So keep the balance of power in place. Okay, Spain, nothing changes too much. Portugal, nothing changes too much. And then Russia takes a little bit of chunk of Poland here. Okay. The Kingdom of Norway and Sweden seems to have united compared to our other maps and whatnot. But generally what we do see is that Germany does not exist. We've got Bavaria and Hanover and Saxony and Prussia and Austria. Okay, we don't have a Germany. And then, of course, we don't have an Italy. We've got northern Italy parts off to Sardinia and to Austria, but we've got all these other states and whatever down here. Kingdom of Two Sicilies, but we don't have an Italy either. So we're going to be looking at those. And then, of course, there is the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire, although it was in Europe here, was never seen as European. It was always seen as a threat to Europe, mainly because it was not a Christian empire, and it was not a constant threat, but a potential threat to the way of life of Christian Europe is this kind of encroaching Ottoman Empire. That'll come into effect in some of our discussions this unit as well. So I invite you to go ahead and check out the section review and just a couple questions, which we will get to right away. Let's get into our section review then. We have a couple definitions, identifies, and answer questions here to kind of get this Congress of Vienna thing sorted out. So we want to define diplomacy. Diplomacy is the making of agreements by officials or diplomats. Countries come to negotiate, discuss things. I think this is always the better option than just taking out your issues militarily on one another. When you can discuss and come to agreement in a peaceful manner, that is better. Now, diplomats might have a very manipulative skill to be able to manipulate and kind of strategically apply themselves. So some people are really good at diplomacy. Okay, balance of power. A defensive strategy to maintain an equilibrium of power. among countries to achieve peace and security. We already talked about how Europe would have been, I guess, propelled to consider setting out a balance of power for the purpose of achieving peace, just because of its abhorrence of the recent violence from the French Revolution and Napoleonic campaigns, which would make sense. I mean, if we went through a great military war, the last thing we want is more war. Most of us. So when we talk about these ideologies, so conservatism at the time was the principle that advocated conserving traditional forms of government, which would have been absolute monarchs, and even what we have in England, which was a constitutional monarch. But the idea was you had a king. And then liberalism was a principle at the time that advocated for more power for elected but limited parliaments. So broadening that input of power from your citizens. So more of an electorate, or more of a democracy. And then, of course, radicalism was the principle or the ideology that supported democratic government and favored drastic change, even to the point of condoning violence or rebellion. So you had all these types of peoples at play, or groups of peoples kind of shaping and shifting the Europe of 1800s. Okay. So the Congress of Vienna was a meeting called by Austria, Great Britain, Prussia, and Russia, and it met in Vienna. And Metternich was the minister, or one of the diplomats, who was an Austrian diplomat who dominated the Congress of Vienna. Then we ask, what was the purpose for which the Congress of Vienna met? Well, in 1815 or 14, they met to restore the boundaries of Europe as they had existed before Napoleon's conquests. Okay, they defeated Napoleon, but they left a huge mess. Okay, it's like the kid who didn't clean his room, and nobody else is there to clean it. So who's going to do it? Well, they have to get together to clean up the mess. And so that's one of the reasons why they had met. They had to redraw the map of Europe and agree how it was going to be redrawn without going to war over how it should look. Now, which countries were the great powers of Europe at the time? Okay, well, there were 5. There was Austria, Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and France. And finally, what were Metternich's 3 goals at the Congress of Vienna? Oh, remember those pictures I forgot to put up? Number 1, to strengthen the countries surrounding France. That would prevent French aggression, or the potential of France to kind of increase its territory at some point. To restore the balance of power through the redrawing of the map of Europe, and to restore royal families to their thrones where possible. And that was it. So I hope you enjoyed that look at the Congress of Vienna. DBL. Take care.